Earl Warren was 3 times elected governor of California, but the year before he was elected governor, he was Attorney General of the state of California. Now, Earl Warren, as you probably, if you're as old as I am, you remember very well, became quintessential, classic, liberal, humanist judge, Supreme Court justice. And I remember those days very well, a great champion of human rights. But in 1942, when he was, just before he was elected governor, he was the main force behind rounding up all of our citizens, 120,000 citizens of Japanese ancestry, and having them interred for the length of the war. Citizens with no process whatsoever, no charges ever brought against them, and no process whatsoever, no legal process, no legal recourse, simply rounded up and put in internment camps. It's one of the great blots on American democracy. The Congress much later, apologized and gave reparations to everyone who was still living. But Earl Warren, at that time, after he was governor for 3 terms of California, they had quite a tradition in California of doing a long series, 7 days, exhaustive interviews with former governors so that they can collect a great deal of data about them and have them in the archives. And on the 6th day of that long interview process, the interviewer said to Earl Warren, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you about the events of the spring of 1942. And Earl Warren's eyes filled with tears. He stood up, he walked out the door, and he never came back for the interview. And so he made a decision that he resented for the rest. He said he was conscience-stricken. He despised the decision that he had made. Later, he realized how much it had hurt people. During that same time, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of very, very racist, anti-Japanese cartoons. And they were made by the man who would become, they were drawn by the man who would become Dr. Seuss. And he later regretted it a great, great deal and visited Japan and saw the destruction of the atomic weapons. And he wrote a book in reparation, to make his own reparation because he realized how damaging his cartoons had been. And he wrote a little book called Horton Hears a Who. I don't know if you read the book by Dr. Seuss. And the tagline is, "People are people no matter how small." That was his way of apologizing. So I start out with such seriousness because Jesus is talking in such a serious way. It's the second part of this. Last week we had it as well, the Sermon on the Mount. This is the end of the Sermon on the Mount. When Jesus is talking in such a serious way, he's obviously not kidding around. You know, we remember what it was last week. If your eye offends you, pluck it out. If your hand offends you, cut it off. And now we have, don't resist evil. Turn the other cheek if you're slapped. And so we have to try to make sense of this kind of seriousness. Jesus is obviously saying the kingdom of God is something that is so serious. He's using that kind of language that he uses sometimes when he's trying to wake us up. And he uses over-the-top extreme language so that we will wake up and go, okay, I guess he's serious about this. Maybe we ought to listen. And so we need to put a little parentheses in here, just a little footnote. Because there's the thing about turning the cheek if you're slapped. This cannot be used. This cannot be used. This cannot be used, I hope that's clear enough, for any kind of abuse towards women or children or anybody else. This cannot be used to justify that. That interpretation is out of bounds. Period. So let's get that straight. So Jesus is talking in that extreme way. And the people who know more about the culture than I do say that these are actual examples of things that happened in his culture and Jesus responding to them. And generally what Jesus is after is, don't return hate for hate. It is better to suffer evil than it is to do evil. That when the choice comes down to it and we have no choice but to suffer evil or to do evil, it is better to suffer evil than to do evil. And so Jesus is trying to get at something with extreme language that we need to pay attention to. And so we need a definition of prejudice that includes everybody. That seems, if when we look at our time with the incredible, political turmoil and polarization, we need a definition of prejudice that includes all of us, so that for once we get all on the same plane and we're all in this together. And so that definition was given to us by a great Jesuit philosopher and theologian, the definition of bias, human bias, which is a result of the fall. It's a result of original sin. And the definition of bias that covers everybody in this room and everybody in this world is, bias is a systematic refusal to ask questions. And we're all guilty of bias. Every single one of us, including me, are all guilty of biases about different things. And it's a systematic refusal to ask questions. It's part of original sin. And I know people don't like to get told that they're biased, but I'm saying to everybody here, we're all biased. And the sooner we accept it, the better we're off, because now we're all in the same boat and we can help one another with our biases. So if we systematically refuse to ask questions about black people, well, then we're prejudiced against black people, aren't we? Because we won't even let the questions that are important to them and their experience of blackness in this, we won't even allow the questions. We're prejudiced. If we won't ask questions about Asian folks, well, then we're prejudiced. If we just systematically refuse to ask any questions about people with an Asian heritage, well, then we're prejudiced against Asians, because we can't even ask the question. We can't let a question begin to penetrate the narrowness of our thinking, because it would make us too uncomfortable, or whatever the reason. It doesn't matter what the reasons are, it's still bias. If I can't ask questions about conservative Republicans, then I am biased against conservative Republicans. And if I can't ask questions about classic liberal Democrats, then I am biased against classic liberal. It's a bias. It's a refusal to ask questions, which is a refusal to understand. If I refuse to ask questions about women, well, then I am biased against women. There was a girl here after the homily last night, and I said to her, you know what? If you ever have a boyfriend and he refuses to ask any questions about girls, he has no curiosity about girls and he can't ask any questions, you have a guy who's prejudiced against girls. You need to know it. And I was joking with the ushers last night, Mark, and I said to Mark afterwards, I said, if people systematically refuse to ask any questions about ushers, they're prejudiced against ushers. And it's a joke, but it's true. And it's what points to us about how we can locate our own bias. When if there's an area in our life where we systematically refuse to ask questions and to gain understanding, therefore, we are biased. We are guilty of bias. And the sooner that we accept that and understand that and grasp that makes perfect sense, the sooner we are towards being a healing community. Because we have to be able to spot bias in ourselves. That makes it much easier for us to spot it in one another and to become healing and to have responses that are healing instead of hate for hate, violence for violence. So once we get it, I mean, I've got plenty of biases. One of mine is I have a bias against the Irish, and I don't even know why. But I have friends who are Irish and love the Irish, and I don't want to even ask any questions. I got it's an irrational bias. And I couldn't tell you why. But it's a bias. I'm prejudiced. I know it. And the sooner we know it about ourselves, the sooner we can help one another. So there's probably never been a time in anyone's memory around that it wasn't easier for us to be offended. We're living in a culture right now that's big on offending one another and taking offense and offending right back. And Jesus is saying something about not being part of that culture of offense and reoffense and reoffense and reoffense until it erupts in violence. And so in our world, how are we going to understand turning the cheek and not returning evil for evil? And I think one of the things is we have to think of ourselves as healers and as a healing community. And so our main job is to heal bias. When someone comes to us and offends us, and they offend us by their remarks, and they push against, and they put pressure on us, and we're offended, the thing that we need to, we have to stop doing reaction, and we have to realize this is not football. We're not playing football, so I don't have to go on the offense, and I don't have to go on the defense, and I don't have to go sit on the bench. Instead, I could try to be a healer. I could try to do something healing in the situation. And that then is to listen, and to listen deeply. First of all, we're not playing football. I'm not playing any of those roles. I'm going to listen, and I'm going to listen deeply. And I'm going to wonder about what the person says. Because what that does is that lifts up a question with it. If there's a question there that I systematically refuse to ask, it will lift up that question within me, and I'll realize there's a place I'm prejudiced. There's a place I've closed my mind. There's a place I don't want to go read an article about. I don't want any more about. And so I have closed my mind. And it is so important that we do this so that we can talk to one another. Catholics have to be able to talk to one another, and we have to be able to talk about the important ideas of our day. We have to be in the conversation of our society, and we have to be able to do it in a way that's healing. And so we've got to stop playing defense, offense, and withdrawing to the sidelines, and instead listening and wondering until the questions arise within us where we may be biased, and to spot the bias in the person who's offending us so that we can maybe ask a question. We can maybe plant a question like a little seed that will grow and work against the bias that they're coming, the place of bias they're coming from. So we could come from, we have 5 big places of bias. We kind of lump our biases into 5 big ways. First one is the common sense bias. That's probably the most common one, common sense bias, which common sense is just like what works for me right now is what's really important. And common sense is biased against study. It doesn't want to take the trouble. It doesn't want to work to do any kind of in-depth analysis. It just wants to know, okay, what's working for me right now? And then that becomes the shoot from the lip. And have nice little phrases and talking points that don't have any depth to them. That's a bias. Now, common sense is sensible, and there's lots of things that common sense is sensible about, but there are a lot of things that don't. Common sense isn't going to do it. It's going to take study. It's going to take analysis. It's going to take depth. It's going to take the work of reading books and reading articles. And so we need to be able to spot when it's just common sense bias. And then maybe we can ask a question that would be healing, like, have you ever read that article by so-and-so on this? I think it offers a lot of insight. That could be healing. We won't win the argument. It's not about winning an argument, but it could be healing. Or we might come away and say, look at that. I don't know. I don't want to ask that question about that. And so maybe I need to, or maybe that's a place where I have narrowed my own mind down and I need to ask that question. I need to at least ask the question. And maybe it's the bias of the group bias. Group bias is just huge right now, which is the bias from my group. I can't ask any questions that would indicate that that other group has something to say and that my group might be wrong. I have to reject everything that is bad about my group so that because I've got to, the world getting better means better for my group. And I can't admit when somebody else on the other side has made a good point or done something that could make things better. I refuse to ask the question. That's bias. And then there's the ego bias, which is about me. And the word making things better means better for me. And I can't even entertain any question from anybody. I can't even see the point of asking a question about what would be better for anybody else. I'm only interested in, that's a bias. We've excluded a whole universe of questions. I can only ask the question about what's better for me. It's a bias. And so what bias does is it narrows our minds. And our spirits have the Spirit of God within them, and our spirits are open to the infinite. We can ask the question of God. Our spirits are open to all that is truly true, all that is really true. And we must open our minds to all that is really true. And it doesn't matter what the party is, and it doesn't matter whether it is about me or not, or my group. It's about the truth, God's truth. And when we succumb to a bias, when we find a bias and we refuse to challenge the bias and to open it up, we take a spirit that God has given to us that lives within an infinite horizon and we close it down to a narrow mind. We take the horizon and we collapse it in to where we're living in a little horizon instead of an infinite one that is open to all truth. And we crave certainty instead of longing for understanding, for more and more understanding by God. And so Jesus makes it clear in these scriptures that the kingdom of God is not just about an individual having a very intense devotional experience with God. It requires a community. The kingdom of God requires a community. And Jesus has been very strict and very over the top in his language to make it clear to us we must be a community of healing and love and forgiveness and learning and understanding, not a community of certainty and offending one another and reoffending and returning evil for evil. That is not further the kingdom of God. And it's not just about us, it's about us. It's about us. And so we have, and this is not, I'm not claiming to be good at this, by the way, but I know what the right thing is to do, and I'm trying to practice it, is that when I'm offended, I need to ask, what's offending them? What's the bias inside of them that is offending them? The battle they've already lost, and that's why they're battling on the outside. Because Jesus' teaching is utterly clear that people do violence on the outside because they lost. People attack and do violence on the outside because they lost an attack and a struggle on the inside. And so we can become healers. We can become healers by listening, wondering. Even if we don't know at the time, we can bookmark it and we can go away and we can ponder it prayerfully and we can wait for the questions. Am I biased? What's the bias that my offender has? How could I help them heal that bias? In our gospel, Jesus says that we must be perfect the way our Father is perfect. And that doesn't mean a neurotic little nitpicking, of course, which sometimes it's been taken for. It's the Hebrew idea of perfection, which is utterly human. It is not a nitpicky perfection. It is perfectionism. It is to be utterly open and to walk with God with complete openness. It means wholeness and completeness in the Hebrew way. And so our job is to walk before God with with every part of our life revealed to God, to walk with God with complete openness and honesty. And if we do that, and perhaps, well, not perhaps, but if we do that, and if we continue to take the Eucharist, and the power of Jesus Christ is in that Eucharist, we can learn how to be people of healing, who do not trade offense for offense, but who can listen and wonder and see what bias is attacking my attacker, and maybe say something healing in return.